Have you ever witnessed a moment so small it could fit in the palm of your hand, yet so powerful it could shatter the foundations of a town? In the sleepy, sun-baked heart of Havenwood, a place where time seemed to move as slowly as honey dripping from a spoon, a 22-year-old waitress named Ilara Vance was about to do just that. It happened on a Tuesday, the kind of sweltering August afternoon where the cicadas buzzed a relentless, drowsy rhythm and the asphalt softened on Main Street. Inside the Starlight Diner, the air was a thick, comforting soup of brewed coffee, sizzling bacon fat, and the faint, sweet scent of the cherry pie cooling on the windowsill. Ilara, or Ellie as everyone called her, moved with a practiced grace between the worn vinyl booths and the chrome-edged counterstools. In her crisp white uniform, a faded blue apron tied neatly at her waist, she was a study in quiet efficiency. Her honey-blonde hair was pulled back in a simple, no-nonsense ponytail, revealing a face that was more determined than classically beautiful, with intelligent hazel eyes that missed nothing. Ellie wasn't just a waitress. She was the diner's memory. She knew that Mr. Abernathy took his coffee black with one ice cube to cool it down, that Mrs. Gable liked her toast barely kissed by the toaster, and that young Timmy from the hardware store always tried to sneak an extra maraschino cherry from the garnish tray. These details were her currency, the small acts of seeing people that made the long hours and aching feet worthwhile. They were also a symptom of a mind trained for observation, a skill she'd honed not in a classroom, but in the quiet, challenging world of caring for her grandmother, whose own memories were slowly, cruelly fading away like watercolor in the rain. The Starlight was half full with the usual lunch stragglers. At a booth by the window, a man sat alone. He was a recent fixture in the diner's daily tableau, appearing every few days for the past month. He wore the anonymous uniform of someone trying not to be seen, a faded baseball cap pulled low, a plain grey jacket despite the heat, and jeans that had seen better decades. He never spoke much, just ordered black coffee and a slice of toast, dry. He'd sit for an hour, nursing the single cup, his gaze lost somewhere beyond the dusty glass. Ellie had mentally nicknamed him Jay. He had the hands of someone who didn't work with them, no calluses, clean nails, but the weariness of a man who carried the world on his shoulders. There was a quiet intensity about him that intrigued her. As she was refilling the sugar dispensers, the bell above the glass door chimed, a harsh, discordant note in the diner's lazy symphony. 2 police officers stepped inside, their polished black boots clicking with authority on the checkered linoleum. The taller one, Officer Cade, had a bulldog's face and a swagger that seemed too large for the small diner. His partner, Officer Mills, was younger, with a perpetual smirk that suggested he found the world a joke and he was the only one in on it. The low hum of conversation in the diner faltered, forks and knives pausing over plates. Havenwood was a small town, and its police force was an intimate, known quantity. Cade had a reputation for enjoying the power of his badge a little too much, for turning minor infractions into public displays of dominance. Ellie felt a familiar knot tighten in her stomach. She'd seen him bully teenagers behind the high school and shake down old Sal, the diner's owner, for donations to the policeman's ball. Cade's eyes swept the room, dismissive and predatory, before landing squarely on the man in the window booth. On Jay. He nudged Mills, a silent, smug communication passing between them. They started toward the booth, their movements slow and deliberate, designed to draw attention. Ellie watched from behind the counter, a dish rag clutched in her hand. Sal caught her eye from the pass-through window to the kitchen, his face pale and worried. He gave her a subtle shake of his head, a clear warning. "Don't get involved. It's not our business." But it felt like her business. This was her flaw. These were her customers. "Afternoon, buddy," Cade's voice boomed, unnecessarily loud. "We've had some reports of a suspicious individual loitering in the area." "Matches your description." Jay didn't look up. He simply continued to stare into the black depths of his coffee mug. "I'm not loitering," he said, his voice quiet but clear. "I'm a paying customer." Mills snickered, leaning against the edge of the booth. "A real high roller, huh? A cup of coffee. We're going to need to see some identification." The diner was now utterly silent, save for the hum of the ancient refrigerator. Everyone was watching, a captive audience to a drama no one wanted. Ellie's heart began to beat a little faster. She knew the law. You didn't have to show ID just for sitting in a diner. This was harassment, plain and simple. "I'm not doing anything illegal," the man said, his voice still level, though Ellie could see his knuckles were white where he gripped his mug. "That's for us to decide," Cade snapped, his patience, always a shallow commodity, wearing thin. "Now, show us the ID, or you can take a ride downtown and we'll figure it out there." He placed a heavy hand on the man's shoulder. That was the line, the physical touch, the casual, unearned assertion of power over a man who had done nothing but exist quietly in a public space. Ellie thought of her grandmother, so frail and vulnerable, and how easily she could be intimidated, pushed around. She thought of the history books she used to love, full of stories of ordinary people who stood up to small tyrannies before they grew large. Sal's warning glance was a distant memory. She placed the dish rag neatly on the counter and walked toward the booth, her soft-soled shoes making almost no sound. "Officers," she said, her voice calm and steady, a stark contrast to the tension crackling in the air. "Is there a problem here? This gentleman is a regular. He's never caused a bit of trouble." Cade turned slowly, his eyes narrowing into slits. "Well, if it isn't Little Miss Sunshine. This is official police business, Ilara. Go back to slinging hash." The condescension in his voice was a spark to dry tinder. Ellie planted her feet, placing her hands on her hips, a gesture she'd inherited from her grandmother. "It becomes my business when you harass customers in my section for no reason. You said he matches a description. What description is that?" Mills scoffed. "That's classified information, sweetheart." "Is it?" Ellie's gaze was direct, unwavering. She wasn't just a waitress anymore. She was a protector of this small, coffee-scented square of the world. "Because I've been here all morning. He's been here for 47 minutes. He hasn't spoken to anyone but me. He hasn't made any calls. He's just been drinking his coffee. So unless the suspicious individual you're looking for is a man quietly minding his own business, I think you have the wrong person." Her precision seemed to momentarily throw Cade off balance. A murmur rippled through the diner. Mr. Abernathy, a retired history teacher, nodded slowly in approval. "You're awfully observant for a waitress," Cade sneered, recovering. "Maybe you should have been a detective." "Maybe you should try being one," Ellie retorted, her voice dropping, gaining an edge of steel. "You walked in here looking for him. You didn't scan the room. You locked right onto him. This isn't an investigation. It's a shakedown." The accusation hung in the air, sharp and undeniable. Cade's face flushed a deep, mottled red. He took a step toward her, his bulk looming. "You're walking a very thin line, girl. Obstruction of justice is a serious charge. And harassing a citizen is a violation of his rights," Ellie shot back, her voice rising now, carrying to every corner of the silent diner. "If you have a warrant for his arrest, then serve it. If you have probable cause to detain him, then state it. Otherwise, you are breaking the very laws you swore to uphold, and you're doing it in front of a dozen witnesses." The man in the booth, Jay, finally looked up. He looked past the officers, his gaze meeting Ellie's. His eyes were a startlingly deep blue, filled with a weariness that seemed ancient. But for the first time, there was a flicker of something else in them. Surprise, and perhaps a sliver of gratitude. "It's all right, miss," he said softly, his voice a low baritone. "I don't want any trouble for you." He started to rise from his seat. "No," Ellie said, her voice ringing with conviction. She didn't look at him. Her eyes were locked on Cade. "You stay right where you are. You have every right to finish your coffee in peace." She turned her body slightly, creating a small, symbolic barrier between the officers and the man. "If you want to remove someone from this diner today, Officer Cade, it won't be him." The silence that followed was absolute. The clatter of the kitchen, the buzz of the refrigerator, the very sound of breathing seemed to have stopped. Cade stared at her, his jaw working silently. He was a bully, and his primary weapon was intimidation. But Ellie wasn't intimidated. She was armed with facts, with righteousness, and with the focused fury of someone who was simply tired of seeing people pushed around. From a corner booth, a teenager who had been silently watching everything slowly raised his phone. The small red light of the recording function was a tiny, defiant star in the tense atmosphere. Mr. Abernathy cleared his throat, his old voice surprisingly strong. "The young lady is correct, Cade. This is unseemly. Leave the man be." Another voice piped up from the counter. "Yeah, what's he done to anybody?" The dam of silence broke. A wave of murmurs and nods of agreement swept through the diner. The power dynamic had shifted. Cade and Mills were no longer two officers controlling a situation. They were two men being judged by a roomful of their neighbors. Cade's face was a mask of fury and humiliation. He knew he had lost. He jabbed a thick finger in Ellie's direction. "This isn't over, Vance. You made a big mistake today." He turned on his heel, motioning sharply for Mills to follow. They pushed through the door, the bell jangling violently in their wake, and disappeared into the glaring afternoon sun. The diner exploded into a cacophony of chatter and applause. Several customers clapped, others buzzed with excitement, replaying the scene for each other. Ellie finally let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her knees suddenly feeling weak. Her hands were shaking. She turned back to the man in the booth. He was watching her, his expression unreadable. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice a little shaky. He nodded slowly. "Thank you," he said, the words simple but imbued with a profound weight. "You didn't have to do that." Ellie managed a weak smile, pushing a stray strand of hair from her face. "Yes, I did," she said, more to herself than to him. "Some things are just right or wrong." As she walked back to the counter, her legs feeling like jelly, Sal rushed out from the kitchen, his face a mixture of terror and awe. "Ellie, what were you thinking? You know Cade. He'll make our lives miserable." "He was already making that man's life miserable, Sal," she said quietly. Somebody had to say something. The man in the booth finished his coffee, left a crisp $50 bill on the table, far more than the cost of his coffee and toast, and slipped out the door as unobtrusively as he had arrived. Ellie watched him go, a deep sense of unease settling over her. She had won the battle, but Cade's parting words echoed in her ears. "This isn't over." She had no idea how right he was. The video from the teenager's phone was already uploading, a digital spark about to ignite a firestorm that would consume her small, quiet life and change the future of Havenwood forever. By morning, the world had tilted on its axis. Ellie awoke not to the gentle prodding of her alarm clock, but to the incessant buzzing of her phone on the nightstand. It was a chorus of notifications, texts, social media alerts, missed calls from numbers she didn't recognize. Her younger sister, Chloe, a freshman at the local community college, burst into her room, her face aglow with the screen of her tablet. "Ellie, you're famous!" she squealed, shoving the device in her sister's face. There she was, in a slightly shaky video, standing in the familiar setting of the Starlight Diner. The video, titled "Havenwood Waitress Shuts Down Bully Cops," had over 1 million views. Her voice, clear and firm, echoed from the small speakers. "It won't be him." Below the video, the comments section was a raging river of opinions. Thousands praised her as a hero, a symbol of everyday courage. A hashtag, "Porsche Stand with Ellie," was trending, but for every supportive comment, there was a venomous one. "Cop hater, attention seeker. She's going to get what she deserves." Ellie's stomach twisted into a cold, hard knot. She felt exposed, as if the entire world were peering through her bedroom window. Getting ready for work felt different. Her blue apron felt less like a uniform and more like a target. As she tied her ponytail, she caught her reflection in the mirror. The same face, the same determined eyes. But the world looking back at her had changed. The atmosphere at the Starlight was electric. The diner was more crowded than she'd ever seen it on a Wednesday morning. Some patrons gave her thumbs-ups and quiet words of encouragement. A few tourists, who had driven in from neighboring towns after seeing the video, asked to take selfies with her. But many of the regulars, the ones who knew Cade and understood the unspoken power structures of Havenwood, just stared, their faces unreadable. Their silence was more unnerving than any open hostility. Sal pulled her aside, his hands wringing his perpetually damp apron. "The chief called," he whispered, his eyes darting around nervously. He wasn't happy, Ellie. He called it a gross misrepresentation of a standard field inquiry. "Cade and Mills are on desk duty pending a review, but that's just for show. They're furious." The retaliation began subtly. That afternoon, Ellie found a $75 parking ticket tucked under her windshield wiper. The violation? Parking more than 12 inches from the curb. Her ancient, beat-up sedan was parked perfectly. The next day, 2 different patrol cars followed her home from her shift, staying just far enough behind to be a menacing presence in her rearview mirror. The harassment extended to the diner. A health inspector, a cousin of Officer Mills, showed up for a surprise inspection, armed with a clipboard and a sour expression. He spent 3 hours combing through the kitchen, citing Sal for a non-standard placement of a fire extinguisher and a minor crack in a floor tile, violations they had overlooked for 15 years. The warnings were clear: fall in line or be broken. The town itself became a fractured landscape. The incident had unearthed a deep schism in Havenwood. On one side were people like Mr. Abernathy, who started a small "We Support the Starlight" campaign, encouraging people to eat there. On the other were those who saw Ellie's actions as an attack on law and order, a disruption to the town's quiet peace. The local newspaper ran a biased article quoting anonymous sources who claimed the man in the diner was a known transient and that the officers had acted appropriately. One evening, Ellie came home to find her grandmother, Clara, sitting in her armchair by the window, her brow furrowed with worry. Clara's dementia often left her adrift in a sea of confusion, but today her mind was lucid, and she had seen the video on the local news. "Elara," she said, her voice thin but firm. "Your grandfather," he always said, "courage is not the absence of fear, but the judgment that something else is more important than fear. You did what was right." She reached out a trembling hand and squeezed Ellie's. The touch was a fragile anchor in the storm, but courage didn't pay the mounting bills for Clara's care. It didn't fix the ugly slash that appeared in one of Ellie's tires overnight. It didn't erase the hateful words spray-painted on the diner's back alley wall. "Cop hater." Sal was nearing his breaking point, Business was suffering as the controversy scared away some of his most loyal customers. He was an old man who just wanted to grill burgers and retire in peace. "Ellie, I don't know how much more of this I can take," he confessed one night, his shoulders slumped in defeat. "There's a man, a developer, Marcus Thorne. He's been trying to buy this whole block for years. He wants to tear it all down, put up some fancy condos. He's been lowballing me, but with all this trouble, maybe it's time to just sell." The name Marcus Thorne rang a bell. He was a local big shot with deep pockets and political connections, known for getting what he wanted, no matter the cost. Ellie felt a chill. Was this all bigger than just two bully cops? Was Jay just a random excuse? Amid the growing despair, something unexpected happened. A sleek black town car pulled up outside the diner. A woman in a sharply tailored business suit stepped out. She introduced herself as Evelyn Reed, a consultant. She said she represented an anonymous client who was an admirer of grassroots courage and was interested in investing in small businesses that represented community values. "My client saw the video of you," Ms. Reed said, her eyes sharp and intelligent. "He was impressed. He believes businesses like the Starlight are the backbone of America and wants to ensure it survives this pressure campaign." She made Sal an offer that made his jaw drop. Not to buy the diner, but to invest, to cover legal fees, pay for repairs and upgrades, and fund a marketing campaign to bring customers back. The offer was so generous it felt unreal. The only condition was that Ellie Vance remain an employee. Sal, with tears in his eyes, accepted immediately. Ellie, however, was suspicious. "Who is your client?" she asked Evelyn directly. "Why would a stranger do this?" "My client values his privacy," Evelyn replied smoothly. "Let's just say he has a vested interest in seeing bullies get their comeuppance. He believes in what you did, Miss Vance. He sees it as an investment not just in a diner, but in character." The mysterious benefactor's influence was felt almost immediately. A top-tier lawyer from the city contacted Sal, offering pro bono services to fight the bogus health code violations. The story of the anonymous investor hit the local news, reframing the narrative. Ellie was no longer just a troublemaking waitress. She was the catalyst for a battle between old town values and predatory forces. The Force Our Stand With Ellie movement gained new momentum, with people sending messages of support and even small donations from all over the country. The man from the diner, Jay, never returned. Ellie found herself thinking about him often. Who was he? Was he aware of the firestorm he had left in his wake? She felt a strange connection to him, a silent partner in an event that had irrevocably altered her life. One afternoon, while sorting through a box of old town records for Mr. Abernathy's local history project, a small side job she did for extra cash, Ellie stumbled upon something. It was a file on Marcus Thorne's development company, Thorne Enterprises. Tucked inside was a list of his holding companies and known business associates. As she scanned the page, her eyes landed on a familiar name from a different context. Officer Cade's brother-in-law was listed as a senior project manager for Thorne. It wasn't a smoking gun, but it was a connection. A dark, ugly thread connecting the harassment at the diner to the ambitions of a powerful developer. Cade wasn't just a bully, he was a pawn in a much larger, dirtier game. And she, by defending a quiet stranger, had inadvertently thrown a wrench into their machine. The fight for the Starlight Diner was no longer just about a single act of defiance. It was about the soul of Havenwood itself. The infusion of capital from the anonymous benefactor acted like a defibrillator on the Starlight's failing heart. The lawyer Evelyn Reed had arranged made the health code violations disappear with a few sharply worded letters. The diner got a new coat of paint, the ripped vinyl on the booths was replaced, and a brand new, gleaming espresso machine was installed, much to Chloe's delight. The message was clear. The Starlight wasn't just surviving, it was fighting back. Ellie found herself in a new, unofficial role. Sal, buoyed by the support, but weary from the stress, began to lean on her for more than just waiting tables. He valued her clear-headedness and resilience. She helped him manage the new budget, place orders with suppliers who were no longer afraid of police intimidation, and handle the media inquiries that still trickled in. She felt a sense of ownership, of purpose, that went beyond just earning a paycheck. Evelyn Reed became a frequent visitor, always arriving in her immaculate town car, her demeanor professional, yet warm. She claimed to be overseeing her client's investment. But Ellie suspected she was also there to observe her. They would sit in a back booth, and Evelyn would ask pointed questions, not just about the diner, but about Ellie's life, her grandmother, her abandoned studies in art history. Ellie had been majoring in it, with a specific focus on historical document analysis and calligraphy, before her grandmother's health had forced her to drop out. It felt strange to talk about her dusty, forgotten passions with this sharp, sophisticated woman. "You have a remarkable eye for detail, Ilara," Evelyn noted one afternoon after Ellie had pointed out a subtle inconsistency in a supplier's invoice. "It's a rare skill." The harassment from Cade and Mills hadn't stopped, but it had changed. The overt intimidation was replaced by a simmering, passive aggression. They would park across the street for hours, their patrol car a silent monument to their grudge. They pulled over Starlight delivery trucks for routine checks that lasted an hour. It was a war of attrition. The real threat, however, was Marcus Thorne. With the diner now financially secure, his strategy of squeezing Sal into selling had failed. So he escalated. One morning, the residents of the entire block, including Sal and the elderly woman who lived in the apartment above the diner, received official-looking notices of eminent domain. The city, citing a newly commissioned and highly dubious urban blight study, was planning to seize the properties for Thorne's redevelopment project. The city council meeting to approve the plan was scheduled in 1 week. Panic swept through the small community. It was a brazen power play, leveraging Thorne's deep-seated connections at City Hall. This was no longer about a diner. It was about people's homes and livelihoods. Ellie felt a surge of cold fury. This was the end game. She spent every spare moment at the town library, digging through archives, zoning laws, and minutes from past city council meetings. She was looking for anything, any loophole or piece of leverage they could use. Mr. Abernathy joined her, his knowledge of Havenwood's history proving invaluable. It was during one of these late-night research sessions that she found it. Buried in the town's charter from 1923 was an obscure bylaw. It stipulated that any redevelopment project affecting a designated historic commercial zone, which Main Street arguably was, required the unanimous consent of all property owners on the block, or a public referendum if even one owner dissented. The bylaw had never been repealed, only forgotten. It was their silver bullet. The night of the city council meeting, the small auditorium was packed. On one side sat Marcus Thorne, flanked by his lawyers and a smug-looking Officer Cade, providing security. On the other side sat Ellie, Sal, Mr. Abernathy, and a dozen other nervous residents of the block. Thorne's lawyer presented the redevelopment plan with slick graphics and promises of jobs and increased tax revenue. He painted the block as a decaying relic, holding back Havenwood's progress. The council members, most of whom were in Thorne's pocket, nodded along, their decision a foregone conclusion. When the floor was opened for public comment, Ellie walked to the podium, her hands gripping a copy of the Old Town Charter. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her voice was steady as she laid out their case, citing the 1923 bylaw, chapter and verse. A stunned silence fell over the room. Thorne's lawyer began to sputter, calling the bylaw archaic and irrelevant. The mayor, a flustered man who clearly answered to Thorne, tried to dismiss her. "This is an interesting historical footnote, Miss Vance, but hardly applicable." "It is applicable because it is the law," Ellie stated, her voice ringing with authority. "And we, the property owners, do not consent. Therefore, according to the town charter, you must either deny this proposal or put it to a town-wide referendum." The council was thrown into chaos. Thorne's face was a thundercloud of rage. He had been so close, only to be thwarted by a 22-year-old waitress and a 100-year-old law. The meeting was adjourned without a vote, a massive victory for the residents. As Ellie and her small group celebrated on the steps of City Hall, Marcus Thorne approached them, his expensive suit doing little to hide his raw fury. Cade was right behind him, a menacing shadow. "You think you're clever, don't you, little girl?" Thorne hissed, his voice low and dangerous. He stepped into Ellie's personal space, his eyes cold as ice. "You have no idea who you're dealing with. This isn't over. I will get that block. I will tear down that pathetic little diner, and I will enjoy watching you lose everything you fought for." Cade took a step forward, his hand resting on his holstered weapon. "You should have stayed out of it," he growled. "Now you're going to pay." It was a naked threat, delivered on the steps of City Hall. But before Ellie could even react, the smooth, quiet voice of Evelyn Reed cut through the tension. "I wouldn't recommend that, Mr. Thorne." Evelyn was standing at the bottom of the steps, her arms crossed. Behind her, a black town car had pulled up to the curb. The back door opened and a man stepped out. He wasn't wearing a faded jacket or a baseball cap. He was dressed in a perfectly tailored dark suit, his bearing one of effortless command. His face was the same. But Benoit. The air on the steps of City Hall was suddenly thin, rarefied, the kind of air you breathe at high altitudes just before the world goes grey at the edges. Ilara felt it in her lungs, a dizzying lightness that had nothing to do with victory and everything to do with the tectonic plates of her reality shifting violently beneath her feet. The name Thorne had spat out, Croft, meant nothing to her. It was a blank space, a sound without context, but the effect it had on Marcus Thorne, a man who moved through Havenwood as if he owned the very sunlight that fell upon it, was profound. The swagger evaporated, the icy confidence shattered into 1,000 shards of raw, primal fear. It was the man beside her who held the world's new gravity. Jay. Except he was no longer Jay. The quiet, weary man from the diner was gone, replaced by a figure of immense, compressed power. The cheap jacket and faded cap had been a costume. The bespoke wool of his suit was his skin. The exhaustion in his eyes had been a veil. Now they were a startling, piercing blue, the color of a winter sky, and they held the cold, clear light of absolute authority. He stood next to her, not touching, yet she felt his presence as a physical shield, a silent declaration that the ground she stood on was now his territory. "Hello, Marcus," Julian Croft said, and the quietness of his voice was more terrifying than any shout. It was the sound of a blade being unsheathed in a silent room. "I believe you've been threatening my business partner." The words took a moment to register. My business partner. The phrase was so absurd, so alien in the context of her life, a life measured in coffee pots brewed and tables wiped, that she almost laughed. It was a line from a different play, and she was wearing the wrong costume. Julian Croft turned his head slightly, his gaze falling upon her. For a fleeting second, the terrifying CEO vanished, and she saw a flicker of the man from the booth, the weariness, the solitude. But it was overlaid with something new, a deep, unnerving respect. It was the look of a master craftsman acknowledging the quality of an unexpected tool. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched the corner of his mouth. "Elara Vance," he said, and the sound of her full name in his low baritone was both a formal introduction and a coronation. He extended a hand, the gesture clean and precise. His skin was cool, his grip firm and brief. "It's a pleasure to be formally introduced. My name is Julian Croft, and I believe I owe you for a cup of coffee." The world did not spin. It locked into a new, terrifyingly sharp focus. The quiet stranger, the anonymous benefactor, the silent observer in her section. They were not separate threads, but a single, complex weave, and she was now inextricably tangled within it. The fight for the Starlight Diner, the battle that had consumed her every waking thought for weeks, was not over. It had been a mere skirmish. The opening shot in a war she hadn't even known was being waged, and she, Elara Vance, waitress and caregiver, had just been promoted to the front line. Later, the diner was a sanctuary of silence in the aftermath of the storm. The familiar scent of stale coffee and fried onions was a comforting anchor in the disorienting sea of the evening's events. The fluorescent lights hummed their familiar, drowsy song, casting long shadows that made the worn-out space feel both intimate and cavernous. Sal sat at a corner booth, nursing a glass of water with trembling hands, his face a canvas of shock and dawning relief. Evelyn Reed, a figure of immaculate professionalism, stood by the counter, her expression unreadable. And at the booth where it had all begun, Elara sat opposite Julian Croft. He had shed his suit jacket, and the stark white of his shirt seemed to absorb and amplify the diner's dim light. He looked less like a corporate titan now, and more like the man she remembered, though the weariness in his eyes had been replaced by a focused, analytical intensity. He turned his coffee mug in his hands, the same way he had all those afternoons, and the simple, familiar gesture was so at odds with the reality of who he was that Elara felt a fresh wave of vertigo. "You have questions?" he stated. It wasn't a question. "I don't even know what to ask," she confessed, her voice barely a whisper. "Who are you?" It was the simplest question, yet the most complex. "I'm a man who was losing a war," he said, his gaze fixed on the black liquid in his mug. "Marcus Thorne and I, we have a history. It's long, it's unpleasant. Several months ago, he orchestrated a corporate takeover that nearly destroyed a company my father spent his life building. He used illegal methods, insider trading, blackmail, but he covered his tracks so perfectly that I had no legal recourse. He didn't just beat me, he humiliated me. I came to Havenwood to disappear, to think, to decide if I even had the will to fight back." He finally looked at her, and his eyes were stripped of their corporate armor. In their depths, she saw a profound, soul-deep exhaustion that she recognized. It was the same exhaustion she felt after a 16-hour shift, after a long night with her grandmother, after another bill arrived that she couldn't pay. It was the exhaustion of fighting a battle you weren't sure you could win. "I didn't come here looking for a cause, Elara. I came here to watch the world and see if there was anything left in it worth fighting for. I sat in this booth for a month, watching people. I saw kindness, yes, but I also saw apathy. I saw people look away. It was confirming my darkest suspicions about human nature. I was becoming brittle." He paused, the silence stretching between them. and then Cade and Mills walked in. I was their target because Thorne's people had been tracking me. They knew I was in this town, vulnerable. Thorne likely sent them to harass me, to provoke a reaction, to get me arrested on some trumped-up charge, to twist the knife one last time. It was a petty, cruel, final victory for him, and I was going to let them. I was tired, Elara. I was so tired of fighting. The confession hung in the air, raw and exposed. He wasn't a billionaire playing games. He was a man at the edge of a precipice. Then you stood up, he continued, his voice softening. You, with your apron and your order pad. You had nothing. You had no power, no influence, no wealth. You had every reason in the world to look away, just like everyone else. But you didn't. You walked into the fire for a complete stranger. You didn't do it because you knew I was Julian Croft. You did it because you thought I was Jay, a nobody who deserved to finish his coffee in peace. In that moment, you reminded me what the fight was actually about. It isn't about stock prices or market share. It's about the line between what is right and what is easy. You drew that line in the linoleum of this floor, and you refused to let them cross it. The anonymous investment, Evelyn's guidance, it hadn't been a test of her courage, she realized. It had been his own. It was him placing a bet, not on her, but on the version of the world she had shown him was possible. So this partnership, she asked, the words feeling clumsy in her mouth. The Havenwood Historic Preservation Project? Is entirely real, he confirmed with a nod. Thorne's weakness is his ego. He wanted this block to build a monument to himself. I'm going to take it from him, not by destroying it, but by preserving it. We're going to turn the Starlight and this entire street into a testament to the idea that community is more valuable than concrete, and I need you to lead it. Me? The sound was incredulous. Julian, I'm a waitress. I know how to balance 3 plates on one arm. I don't know how to run a multi-million-dollar foundation. You know how to see people, he countered, his gaze unwavering. You knew Mr. Abernathy needed an ice cube in his coffee. You knew Mrs. Gable's toast. You knew that teenager had his phone out before anyone else did. You saw the connection between Cade and Thorne in the town archives. Your art history major, as you called it, wasn't about paintings. It was about learning to see the details, the provenance, the truth hidden beneath the surface. That is a rarer and more valuable skill than any MBA. I can hire people with MBAs. I can't hire your character, Elara. I can't hire your courage. He leaned forward slightly, his intensity a magnetic force. I don't want a pawn. I need a partner. Someone who will tell me when I'm wrong. Someone who understands the soul of this place. Will you help me? She looked around the shabby, beloved diner. She thought of her grandmother's trembling hands, of Sal's terrified eyes, of the quiet dignity of the man who had sat in this very booth. She had already walked into the fire. This was just a question of whether she was willing to stay and tend the flames. Yes, she said, her voice clear and firm, the single word sealing a pact that would change everything. Yes, I will. The war that followed was not one of grand cinematic battles, but a slow, grinding siege fought in the sterile trenches of law offices and deposition rooms. Thorne did not surrender. He doubled down, his fury manifesting as a campaign of legal and public attrition. His lawyers filed a flurry of countersuits, painting Julian as a vindictive corporate raider, and Elara as his naive, opportunistic puppet. The local paper, owned by one of Thorne's holding companies, ran editorials questioning her motives, hinting at a sordid affair, and portraying her as a fame-hungry girl who had brought chaos to their peaceful town. The town, once united in its support, became fractured again. Some saw the influx of Croft's money and lawyers as a hostile takeover of a different kind. The whispers followed Ellie down the aisles of the grocery store. Who does she think she is? She's in way over her head. The crucible came during a deposition for their lawsuit against the city. Ilara sat at a long, polished table in a soulless conference room, the air thick with the scent of expensive cologne and predatory intent. Across from her sat Thorne's lead attorney, a man named Sterling, whose smile never reached his cold, reptilian eyes. Julian and Evelyn were beside her, but she knew this was a test she had to face alone. Sterling began with condescension, his questions designed to diminish her. "Miss Vance, could you please state your occupation prior to your association with Mr. Croft?" "I was a waitress at the Starlight Diner," Ilara said calmly. "A waitress," Sterling repeated, letting the word hang in the air. "And you expect this panel to believe that you, with no business background, no formal training, independently uncovered a century-old bylaw that just happened to derail my client's multi-million-dollar development project?" "I don't expect you to believe it," Ilara replied, her voice even. "I expect you to read the library's sign-in sheets for the 2 weeks prior to the council meeting. You'll find my name there every single night. You can also check the checkout records for the town charter archives. My name will be there too. It wasn't luck, Mr. Sterling. It was research." He shifted tactics, his voice taking on a slimy, insinuating tone. "And your relationship with Mr. Croft? He sits in your diner for weeks, a mysterious, wealthy man. You perform one act of theatrical defiance, and suddenly you're his business partner. It's quite a fairy tale, isn't it? What exactly are the terms of this partnership?" Ilara met his gaze without flinching. Her heart was hammering, but she thought of her grandmother's mantra. Courage is not the absence of fear. "My terms," she said, her voice dropping, gaining the same edge of steel it had held that day in the diner, "are that the people on my block get to keep their homes, that Sal gets to retire with dignity instead of being bullied into selling the business his father built, that the history of our town isn't bulldozed for another set of sterile condominiums. My partner's terms," she added, glancing at Julian, "are his own. But I've found they align perfectly with the simple idea that powerful men like your client don't get to write the rules for everyone else." She leaned forward slightly. "You see, Mr. Sterling, you and Mr. Thorne made a critical mistake. You looked at me and saw a waitress. You saw someone insignificant, someone who would look away. You never actually saw me at all." A dead silence filled the room. Sterling's smug expression faltered. In that moment, Ilara felt the last vestiges of the timid, uncertain girl she had been fall away. She wasn't a waitress playing a role. She was Ilara Vance, and she belonged at this table. From the corner of her eye, she saw Julian look at her, and the quiet pride in his expression was more valuable than any stock portfolio. That deposition marked the turning of the tide. Her testimony, clear, intelligent, and unbreakably honest, was leaked to a national news outlet. The narrative shifted definitively. The story was no longer about a corporate feud. It was about a community's fight for its soul, led by an unlikely hero. Thorne's empire, built on a foundation of bullying and intimidation, began to crumble under the weight of public scrutiny and the federal investigation Julian's team had triggered. Rebuilding was a slower, quieter, more intricate process. The Havenwood Historic Preservation Project began not with demolition crews, but with architects and historians. Ilara was at the center of every decision. She insisted that the original counter of the Starlight, scarred with the history of 70 years of coffee cups and conversations, be lovingly restored. not replaced. She fought for a design that would incorporate a small, soundproofed reading room, a tribute to Mr. Abernathy. She worked with a local non-profit to develop the job training program she'd dreamed of, interviewing every nervous teenager herself. One brisk autumn afternoon, Julian found her not in a boardroom, but in her grandmother's small, sunlit living room. Clara was having one of her lucid days. She sat in her armchair, her hands, gnarled with age, resting on a photo album. Elara was on the floor beside her, pointing at pictures. Julian stood quietly in the doorway, hesitant to intrude. Clara looked up, her faded blue eyes, so different from Julian's piercing ones, seeming to look right through him. "You're the sad man from the diner," she said, her voice a fragile whisper. Julian was taken aback. Yes, Ma'am. I suppose I was." Elara has a knack for finding sad people, Clara continued, a faint, knowing smile on her lips. Her grandfather was one, a good man, but he carried the war inside him his whole life. She knew how to sit with him, how to be quiet. It's a gift, that kind of seeing. She looked from Julian to her granddaughter. "You're not so sad anymore." It wasn't a question. It was an observation, as clear and true as any fact presented in a courtroom. Later, as they walked out into the crisp evening air, Julian was uncharacteristically silent. "She does that," Elara said softly. "Sees things." "Yes," Julian replied, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't quite name. "She does." The grand reopening of the Havenwood Historic Block was a year to the day after the City Council meeting. It wasn't a stuffy, corporate affair. It was a town block party. The street was filled with music, laughter, and the smell of Sal's consultant-approved pancakes. The starlight was gleaming, yet familiar. The old counter shone under new lights. The walls were adorned not with generic art, but with photographs of Havenwood through the decades, curated by Mr. Abernathy. In the new reading nook, children sat listening to a story. Elara moved through the crowd, no longer an employee, but a host, a leader. She was dressed in a simple dress, her hair pulled back in its usual ponytail, but she wore an aura of quiet confidence that was more commanding than any power suit. Late in the afternoon, as the sun began to dip below the rooftops, she found a moment of peace behind the counter, instinctively wiping it down with a clean cloth. The rhythm of the work was a part of her, a connection to the woman she had been and the woman she had become. The bell above the door chimed its new, softer tune. Julian walked in, weaving through the remaining patrons. He wore jeans and a simple grey sweater, looking almost like the Jay she had first met. He slid onto a stool, the same one he had always chosen. "It's beautiful, Elara," he said, his eyes taking in the vibrant, happy chaos of the room. "Everything you envisioned." "We envisioned," she corrected him gently. He gave a small smile. "I just signed the checks." They fell into a comfortable silence, the hum of the diner, a language they both understood. "The usual?" she asked, her own smile finally breaking through, warm and genuine. "Please," he said. "Black coffee. No ice cube." She poured the coffee, her movements fluid and practiced. As she set the heavy ceramic mug down on the polished wood of the counter, her hand brushed his. The contact was brief, accidental, but it sent a current of warmth through her, a quiet acknowledgement of the journey that lay between that first cup and this one. She had not been a damsel, and he had not been a prince. They were two solitary people who had found themselves on the same side of a line drawn in the dust. He had given her a platform, and she had given him a reason to fight. It was a partnership forged not in a boardroom, but in a moment of unexpected, world-altering courage. Looking at him, at the town she had helped to heal, at the reflection of the determined woman staring back at her from the gleaming chrome of the espresso machine, Ilara Vance understood. Courage wasn't a single, explosive act. It was the quiet, daily decision to show up, to pay attention, to do the right thing, to see the person sitting alone in the corner and believe they were worth fighting for. And sometimes it was as simple and as profound as pouring a perfect cup of coffee.